Welcome all to this evening's presentation from Linda Gilkison. Do you really know what the problem is? We are present here on the territorial land of the Hokuminum and the Sinchothed-speaking Coast Salish peoples. We're humbly in stewardship to these lands, to their ancestral lineages, and are grateful for their leadership with our people, with our first people, as they lead us in traditional knowledge of stewardship, reciprocity to the land and its creatures, from which we can all learn. My name is Sheila Doby, and I'm co-chair of the Salt Spring Island Farmland Trust. This event this evening is being hosted by the Salt Spring Island Farmland Trust within its knowledge series of programs, and it is funded by the federal and provincial partnership called Knowledge Transfer Funds, held by the BC Ministry of Agriculture, and supported by your generous donation. The Salt Spring Island Farmland Trust is a not-for-profit registered charity, and our mandate is to preserve and regenerate agricultural lands on Salt Spring Island, and with this build our food resilience through education, community gardens, operating farmland, and the Burgoyne Valley Community Farm, and the operation of our food hub, The Root, on Pettis Road. We hope you will enjoy our newsletter or reach out through our website and see what more of what we're up to. And we also have BJ Mills from the Ministry of Agriculture with us here tonight. And we've invited him to offer a 1-minute introduction of what he's up to and what his services are. Thank you, BJ. I'll give you 1 minute. How does that sound? Is that okay?
Sounds great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I just want to introduce myself. I'm the regional agrologist with the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food. So I cover the central Vancouver Island and Salt Spring region. And so our provincial team of regional agrologists and specialists work with the agriculture producers, industry groups, and local governments to help increase their knowledge, improve practices, address agriculture-related concerns, and offer support and funding opportunities. So some of these examples include collaborating on workshops such as this one, business planning, land use planning, mental health supports, finding commercial farm organization funding, agriculture program development, and crop and animal production related support. So I was born on a farm in the prairies and continue to grow crops on 2 different family farms here on Salt Spring Island. And my area of practice for the past 20 years has been with horticulture crop production and integrated pest management, helping growers increase crop yields and reduce pest problems in practical sense. So
yes, well, and it's been great to work with you, BJ. It's really been great to work with you. Thank you so much. Yeah. So tonight is the first of a 2-part series, and it's about figuring out the problems in your garden or farm based on what you're observing, the conditions, diagnosing the crop problems, and assessing the cause of the damage. To quote Linda, if you don't have the correct diagnosis, there's no way to successfully treat a problem or prevent it in the future. The next session on October 10th will be about how to deal with these problems, should they be disease or insects or the environment. Both sessions will be recorded and sent to all of the registrants after the October 10th session. After Linda's presentation here tonight, there will be a question and answer period that Kaya will help us curate and send those. And so your questions for this session will be placed in the chat, and they'll be taken in the last 30 minutes. And now, Nick, I invite you to introduce Linda.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks, Sheila. It's our distinct pleasure and such a joy to be able to work with Linda and to have her knowledge and support so generously offered to the community at large. And we've got people from all over the region joining us tonight on this Zoom call. Linda is a wealth of knowledge in her lifetime of study and practice. She earned a PhD in entomology from McGill University, and from 1991 to 2002, worked for the provincial government, promoting programs to reduce and eliminate pesticide use. And she has just published an expanded 3rd edition of her pest management guide, West Coast Gardening, Natural Insect, Weed, and Disease Control. We are going to include her full bio in the chat, as well as a link to her website where a lot of her resources are available. She publishes many articles and incredible guides to the community for all sorts of growing practices here. And we are so honored and grateful to be able to co-facilitate this session with everybody tonight. Without further ado, I hand it over to you, Linda.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. And believe it or not, I had quite a bit of fun renovating this slideshow. I used to give a talk like this, a much more simplified version to gardeners. And in previous years. And as I went through, given that, this old slide set, and I started buffing it up and saying, figuring out what else I wanted to say, I realized, that was a real old school slide set, because the huge role the climate change, the extremes of temperature and drought that we're experiencing in recent years is playing a huge role in damage to our crops. And there's a whole lot of different new material I needed to add, because I have a whole lot of new and different pictures of things that have occurred to crops, vegetables, fruit, and our crops. And so we're going to talk about that a lot tonight. But I wanted to start with the "do you really know what the problem is" issue, because, if you don't know, you're done. There's nothing you can do that will successfully treat the problem. And the emphasis in an integrated pest management program at any time is to get to a position where you prevent the problem in the future. If you don't even know what the problem is, you're not going to prevent it, never mind control it. But I do have a couple quick tips here, and I know I have a lot of gardeners, and I know some people in my courses have seen these before, but I always bring them up because people don't realize that most of the insects in the universe are not pests. If you see something flying around a garden or a farm during the day, it's not a pest. I can tell you right now, the only exception is this little critter, the white butterfly, and this is not a cabbage moth. It's a cabbage butterfly. And but when you look at all these other things, what are they doing? They're pollinators, they're predators, they're butterflies, they're all sorts of other animals fly around our gardens. And you don't have to even give them a thought. They are not a pest problem. And when we look at the soil system, all kinds of things live there as well. And the bigger organisms that we can see, like ground beetles and centipedes and this pill bug, this wonderful spider that eats pill bugs, they move pretty fast. And that's a diagnostic for, if it's a predator, it has to really scamper along. So if it spooks you a bit because it moves quickly, that's probably the very creature you're not worrying about. Now, something that I think a lot of people don't realize is how specific pathogens that cause disease and pests that attack our crops are on what plants they can eat. So most of them are highly specific. We have a very few, we have a climbing cutworm that'll eat more different kinds of plants. But basically, if it's a fungus disease, it's going to go on a very specific plant that fungus is adapted to. And the scab diseases that are on pear and apple, they're not even the same fungus. And they certainly wouldn't go not only on each other, but they wouldn't go on any other kind of trees. And I got an email today of someone saying, how do you treat leaf curl on apples? I think I should spray it with sulfur. Well, apples don't get leaf curl. So whatever's going on with that tree, I'm waiting for a picture, is not leaf curl disease. I don't know what it is. It could be, there's things that make the leaves curl, but it's not leaf curl disease. So they're very specific, and insects are the same way. So you don't have to be worried if some plant is failing or has what may be a disease or has an insect attack. It's not likely to be generalized onto more than that crop or that specific plant group. I mean, even aphids, people think there's just aphids. Well, my gosh, there's many, many species of aphids. And the pictures here, all these aphids, there's a cabbage aphid in the middle here, and this is a plum aphid over here. They don't attack anything else. The cabbage aphid isn't going on your roses or beans or peas. The ones up on the maple trees on the boulevards, that's what their host is. So they don't cross over either, even though it may feel to you like there's aphids on a lot of things. It's all different species. But here is kind of the, I think the important thing for tonight is that things wrong with the growing environment that cause disorders in plants or injure them actually do more damage than pests or diseases. And I'm laughing. BJ and I go back a few years, and we were laughing on the phone the other day about, people always think it's an insect. They always blame the insects, and we love insects, really, it's almost never an insect. But they're the first thing that gets blamed. But in fact, when you go, you find out what's being sent into the diagnostic labs for growers and master gardeners and things, about more than half of the samples that go into the Washington State University lab or our provincial lab in Abbotsford, the pathologists there identify the problems as being due to something wrong with the growing environment or direct injury, from poor growing conditions. So this is what the technically people call abiotic, meaning not biological. It is something wrong with the growing environment. So this brings us to relative causes of plant damage. If you say that more than half of things are things wrong with the growing environment that cause these environmental disorders or injury, so that's more than half right there. And then in this climate generally, fungi and a group called water molds or oomycetes, which is like late blight, probably a little more than insects, mites, and their relatives. And then there's this very minor part that bacteria and viruses play. So this is not a scientific approximation. It's just an approximation of what. So when you're, the bottom line here is if you have no idea what the problem is and you decide to just take better care of your plants or try and, improve the growing conditions, you're going to be likely right more than half the time. And so tonight I'm focusing on how to distinguish these environmental caused problems or disorders or injury from damage that would be caused by insects or pathogens that cause disease. Next time in October, after people have submitted what pests and diseases they're concerned about, we'll focus on specific ones, and we'll actually get down to preventing and managing that specific problem. So I'm not really going to talk about that tonight, but I'm going to talk about how to identify it. So let's go back to our environmental disorders, because that's the biggie. So physical injury, you can see this dinged tree trunk up here. This is probably a lawnmower or weed whacker or something. That is the point of entry for pathogens and in some cases insects. Extreme temperatures, drought stress, or the other side of the coin, waterlogging. Developmental disorders, and I'll show you some examples of those where the plants are developing under conditions that just cause flowering and fruiting to go haywire. We have pollination disorders, nutrient deficiencies, and very complicated metabolic disorders, which actually a couple of them are very common. If you see this tomato here, that is black, that's a very common tomato disease. It's not a disease, sorry, a tomato metabolic disorder that looks like disease. And then we have chemical injury, and you might all be saying, but I'm an organic gardener, I don't have a chemical injury. Well, yes, you can very easily have chemical injury to plants. Using dormant or summer oils, drifting onto plants with leaves that are sensitive, very common. Spray drift of any kind. You may not realize it, but insecticidal soap and sulfur sprays both are very hard on the cuticles of leaves, and repeated use can burn a lot of different plants. And then there's a label on both of those showing plants that these should never be used on. And then people don't really realize that if they make up some pesticides out of household ingredients, well, one, that's illegal, but two, those things can be easily as damaging as any of the commercial products that are available. And then in years that we have really a lot of ice and snow, even salt runoff from roads can do quite a bit of damage to nearby plants. So that's all chemical damage. We have physical injury. This year, there were a lot of hailstorms in the spring, and the dings and marks on plants don't really show up immediately. They sort of show up after you've forgotten that we had a hailstorm. And that's what this kind of injury is. So it's just physical injury. Something that's more common for people that are growing cabbage family, mustard family crops is the growing point, the apical meristem. This is actually the growing point of a broccoli. It's been injured and it's been ruined. The cells have been killed, and that can happen for a variety of ways. It could be physically just been planted very roughly and actually damaged it, but mostly it's from things like a late frost or extreme early heat, or sometimes even insect damage. But the result is that these cells can never make, in this case, a cabbage or a broccoli head. And you get these plants that just produce leaves and they never produce heads. So that's injury to the growing points. It can be from a variety of reasons. A quick example of a pollination disorder, which is extremely common in squash now, is that the fruit grows for a while and then it starts to rot at the tip. And it's well after the flower blossom has fallen off. So people are quite sure that it's something that they did. They watered wrong, they didn't feed it, they don't know, they think it's a disease. All that is a fruit that actually comes from a flower that wasn't fertilized. So the fruit actually can grow a little bit and then it just shrivels and drops off. And nowadays, in a lot of places, especially in urban areas, there's such a large decrease in the pollinator population that people have to do the pollinating themselves. You have to break off a male flower and tap that pollen into the center of the female flower, and routinely do that every morning. Otherwise, it's just astonishing. It's very hard for people to get squash now in a home garden. But those are just examples of the kinds of things. It takes a little bit of sleuthing to figure it out. But I really want to do this next section on the extremes of temperature, which are really increasingly common as a cause of plant damage. So we have higher average temperatures. Obviously, we've had, by my count, 3 major heat waves this summer. Of course, it was only 2 years ago that we had the heat dome, which was a really, really extreme heat. But last fall, in October, we actually had another heat dome that would have been as hot as the one in 2021 if it had occurred a little bit earlier in the summer. So these extreme heat periods are now going to be with us, and extended periods because the jet stream's slowing down. And that means high temperature weather patterns can stick, and so can low temperature ones. It's only been a few years since we had the coldest February on record. We had 3 weeks of a cold cell just sitting on top of the lower mainland and island here, because it's just the way the weather patterns are. We have drier summers. This one was quite a dry summer, but no one can forget the great floods of the lower mainland 2 falls ago in November. That was really an atmospheric river that hit and caused so much rain in a limited area that there was really severe flooding. So, and increasing storm temperature intensity, high winds. The bottom line is really that everything is changing, and it's changing rapidly. And some of these have been unprecedented extremes. And so we're just going to have to adapt. And I think we have to rethink every aspect of our growing methods to avoid damage, to keep producing crops. It's not easy. But when I think of how much my garden, just a home garden, has changed in 30 years to keep adapting. And we have to do that big time in our crops, in our commercial crops. I just wanted to show you a couple quick slides here. The climate projections for our region certainly show warmer average temperatures. This was the historic, the oranger it is, the warmer it is, and projected by, only 15 years from now, to the middle of the century, a considerably warmer climate. That's average. That's an average temperature. What we have seen in the last 30 years is that our winter minimums have decreased. So yeah, it's getting warmer on average. And in fact, our winters have been warmer on average. But what is going to control what we, affect what we can grow is how cold it's actually getting in its minimum and how hot it's actually getting in the summertime at its maximum. Those are maybe the parameters that we have to work with. Average isn't really doing much for us. So, Victoria and Qualicum Beach, this regression line was calculated by Glenn Jameson, who used to work for DFO. He's a retired DFO scientist. And he's noticed that our minimums, while they pop around, they have been on average actually going down. So cold injury, just to stick with that, is worse when cold occurs unusually early, like on October, November. We have plants that are hardened off. Or if it occurs quite late, like after February, again, when trees have begun to bloom, and even some of the early vegetables might be in. If it's early damage in the fall, the plants aren't hardened off yet. If it's a late spring cold, it damages plants that have begun their growth, kills fruit blossoms. And this is another this is a blind cauliflower with the growing point that was frosted. So it never ever could produce a cauliflower. It just became an immensely lush, leafy thing. This spring, I was quite surprised. Remember how hot it was in May? Oh, it was really hot in May. And I got sent this picture that was taken, it was either June 18th or 19th. The person wasn't sure. I looked at this picture. This can't have been heat. But maybe it was heat. We went around and around the block on that. And I finally said, you know, it looks like frost damage. And it was that week we were actually getting some pretty low temperatures. Of course, I live at a higher elevation, so a lot of the cold air drains down. And I said, is there any chance this squash is growing in a frost pocket? And she said, oh yeah, bottom of the garden, it's always cold down there. Well, that was the 18th of June after, you know, heat waves and a very, very warm May. We still can get enough frost occurring quite unexpectedly. And it's these late frosts that do a lot of damage because we've started crops early or trees have burst into blossom early. And really lush foliage like this can be damaged. It doesn't have to go to zero. It can be, or to freezing. It can be just a degree or two above. Something else that happens to our biennial vegetables, and a lot of things we do grow are biennial vegetables, meaning they have a 2-year life cycle. When we have good weather in the spring and plant these crops, and then we get a cold week or two, or just, you know, 10 days, of pretty cool weather going down to 5 or 10 degrees at night, that causes these plants to send up their seed stock early, because the signal for a biennial plant that it is its second year, so that it will now produce flowers, is winter. So winter cold tells the plant, oops, time to stop growing leaves now, and the next thing you're going to do when it warms up again is produce flowers. And if you try and plant some of these biennial plants nice and early, that can work if we don't get any cool weather. But then one year it doesn't work because we got some unusually cool weather, like that cold spell in June, and an awful lot of onions and chard and leeks went to seed this spring on people that shouldn't have gone to seed till next year. And that can be a massive loss for a grower that has put out a whole field of early seedlings trying to get an early crop. So it only happens if plants are of reasonable size. Well, actually, they don't have to be very big. I mean, 5 leaves of a cabbage plant that's 5 leaves, has 5 leaves, can be what's called vernalized. This is changing its growth pathway to produce seed. And, you know, the bigger onion sets and leeks and things like that, they are pretty readily vernalized. And then we go straight to things like direct heat injury, which you also see it called sun scald. I'll keep calling it heat injury just to make it consistent for the rest, but sun scald is another name for it. It's not sunburn, which is a bit different. Sunburn actually is when plants are not used to this full spectrum light, say they've been raised in a greenhouse, and then they're put straight out into the garden or farm, and they don't have an adjustment period to basically get their suntan. They actually burn like we would if we weren't used to the sun at all. And this leaf cells and stem cells can die. So what I'm going to talk about now is what happens to plants when it gets too hot. And I'm talking about our temperate zone vegetables and crops. As it gets hotter, growth slows. They don't just keep growing faster and faster. And photosynthesis actually stops in the plants we grow above about 25 degrees to 35 degrees, depending what the plant is. And, you know, in the heat dome, my house, it was 45 in the shade. So there's no chance any plants were doing any growing during the heat dome. They can't. Photosynthesis cannot operate. If it's hot enough, it just simply kills leaf and fruit cells. And I was quite shocked to harvest dry beans this year and discover the burning injury from the heat injury went right through the pods and into the seeds. And of course, this kind of heat stresses plants. It stresses all the things plants do internally. Flowering, seed production, fruit production, and you often get poor flavors. People complain about how poor their tomatoes are when it's a hot summer. So we need to remember that the more hot days there are in the growing season, the longer it can take some of our crops to mature. Cabbage will take longer to grow if it's hot than if it's cool. And really hot days can be considered lost growing days. So again, that affects our planting schedules. And then, of course, crops that have a flower and fruit that have to produce the seeds and pods in case of beans and peas, or fruit in the case of tomatoes and peppers, the pollen is vulnerable to being sterilized by high temperatures. So when we get above 30 or 32 for tomatoes, and that's not that hot, the flowers can just die. This pollen is sterilized and the flowers just drop off. Pepper flowers, it's even lower temperatures. And when you always wondered why, peas and beans had nice long pods in the spring and shorter ones later. It's because some of the pollen in the flowers are being pollinated as the flower opens. That pollen is being ruined and the pods can get really short in heat waves, which matters if you're trying to sell a decent looking pea to someone. Heat stress in potatoes, I'm not kidding when I said I have got examples of all kinds of heat-related problems in these recent years. But this is more of a problem with potatoes and planters. This is when gardeners put potatoes in bags and pots and planters and things. It's way too hot for their roots. It's more likely to see this in planters than in potatoes grown in the ground. But here are some of the growth abnormalities. High temperatures can really foul up flower development because that's a very precise physiological pathway has to be followed. And when cells in the plant are subjected to extreme heat, some of the processes in the cells get disrupted, and then the whole rest of the chain of events can't happen. This is a squash flower that has male and female parts in the same flower. That is heat deformity. Of course, there's going to be no fruit. Another deformity that happens in squash, and I actually had some this summer do it again, is the squash will form and the female flower never opens. It just stays attached to the squash. And of course, it can never be fertilized. That's a heat problem as well. But I know everybody that has grown cauliflower has seen this happen to cauliflower in hot weather, or Romanesco. It's just, they can't take the heat, and that is the kind of growth abnormality we see. But when you think of a crop like tomatoes, people think of tomatoes as a hot season crop. They're not. They're a warm season crop. Commercial tomatoes grown in hot countries are grown in big fields, and the plants are sprawling all over the ground, and all the fruit is under a heavy canopy of leaves. They're not carefully staked up and like a garden tomato might be. And that is something that we're going to have to rethink how we grow our tomatoes in our gardens, because leaving as much foliage as possible to shade the fruit will prevent this from happening. This is cells in the fruit itself that have been exposed to direct hot sun. And now the chlorophyll, the whole process has been disrupted by heat. So these green pigments can never change, break down, and turn into the red pigments. And so this never ripens. So you get these white, yellow, or if you cut it open, sometimes it's white inside. It's never going to ever ripen. Combining, in addition to heat stress, there's drought stress, and plants can take some drought stress. They're not terribly fragile. They can take a little bit of stress, moderate wilting, and recover. But the thing to remember is that when they're in this state of wilt, even of moderate wilting, they are not growing. They have to stop growing. There's no photosynthesis going on. So again, a squash that spends the middle of the day looking like this is not growing. It can't. So, and dehydration, if it gets really severe, these whole cellular processes again get disrupted. The reason the plant is wilting, when the plant wilts, what it does is it closes the pores on the underside of the leaf that are essential for letting out oxygen, taking in carbon dioxide, the whole photosynthesis, but they also let moisture out. And so the plant, in order to not have a disastrous loss of moisture, has to close those stomata. So that means no photosynthesis. It means no food from the soil, because the transpiration process that plants need to have happen to move nutrients from the soil and water into the roots and through the plants depends on those stomata being open, and they have to close. So basically it's a shutdown. It's a survival technique. If it's extreme wilting and it's cold weather, they recover quite well. If it's extreme drought in hot weather, that's another thing altogether. I'll just show you some drought stress specific things that can happen. These horrifying disorder happening to potatoes, that looks like the worst disease ever, and it's just a growth disorder from irregular water supply, basically too dry and then too wet. And there may be a calcium deficiency, but the problem is when it is very dry, plants can't get calcium from the soil, so it may not be a calcium deficiency in the soil, it's just a deficiency in the potato. So, but when we combine heat and drought together, it is far more devastating. Drought-stressed plants are injured by high temperature at lower temperatures than plants are that are really well watered. A really well watered plant will keep transpiring like mad. A lot of water will be evaporating away. If it gets really hot, eventually that plant still has to stop that process. But if it's already in dry soil and has no extra water to transpire, the whole impact to the plant can happen at lower temperatures. So the combination of heat with drought, or just dry periods alternating with irrigation, can be really devastating. As I said, the leaves have to close up those stomata, the little leaf pores. So they lose their cooling, because evaporation of moisture from the leaves cools the leaves. So the leaf temperatures jump right up. And that means you get heat in. And here's a fig leaf. Figs, I mean, you think of figs, they're from hot climates. But this is a fig that was damaged by a combination of heat and drought. So again, no photosynthesis is going on, and so they can't produce any food in the plant cells. No movement of water from the roots is going on, so no nutrients that are in the soil are getting into the plant. So heat and drought stress together, and they often do occur together, cause more damage than either of these conditions separately. So now we move to diagnosing this, because this is where I want to show you that some of these things are they really look like disease, and sometimes they even look like insect or mite damage too. So are we looking at plants that have been damaged by heat and or drought? And one of the ways we can tell is looking at where the injury is. It's between the leaf veins. So look at this charred leaf. It's between the veins. It's on the margins of leaves. It's on the part of the leaf that's farthest from where the moisture is, the sap is moving in the stem. So it's more remote parts of the leaf. It's between the veins, and it gets worse as you get to these more these farther away portions of the leaf. And it's directional too. This is a bean leaf, and you can see it's shining. No pathogen would cause a disease that would look like the sun had been shining on the leaf in a directional way, so that the piece of the leaf that is most directly straight onto the sun is showing the injury. And again, it's between the veins. We saw a lot of fruit injury this year. The closer fruit gets to being mature, having the most moisture in it and the full size, the easier it is to injure it in a heat wave. And you get there's a little bit of a heat injury on an apple. This apple is not going to keep at all. You can perfectly use it in the kitchen, but it's not going to be stored to be sold. And this is a more severe spot burned in an apple. So anytime you see water-soaked spots or browned or shriveled areas, and it's the side facing the sun, there's a whole side of a pepper that's just fried. Raspberries, after the heat dome, everybody, which was the very last week of June, everybody's raspberries had these gray and tan dead drupelets in the berry, and that was heat. This is grapes. I saw a lot of that this year. And even tomatoes can fry in the sun, directly fry. This is heat injury. What's happened here is that after this tissue has been killed by full sun, this was down on Rainbow Road. This was a full shining field, sun shining on field tomatoes. After this tissue is killed, then a secondary pathogen gets in called botrytis. So this is only able to infect this tomato because the tissue was already injured and died. So tomatoes can have heat injury. And something to be aware of for people that have orchards is that heat and drought stress in fruit can cause crop loss the following year. So what people don't realize, I think, is that say an apple tree, the job of an apple tree in the growing season is to grow leaves and shoots. It's going to, at least until about the middle of August, it's putting on new leaf growth. And it also has to mature the apples that are on the tree, but it is actually doing a third thing that we can't see, which is laying down the food in the buds, flower buds, for next year. And if it's stressed in a growing year, it's got a crop to mature and it's got to grow, what gets shorted is the buds for next year. So the tree may just not have very many flowers next year, or it may have flowers, but most of the fruit that might form just falls off. It's not fertilized, the tree can't carry it. And it's called the June drop, but it's a heavy June drop. And it is just drought stress. Any kind of stressor on a tree can cause this to be well into the future, long after we have, forgotten about what the season was like last year. And we do need to remember that plants that are stressed, and especially by drought, are more susceptible to insect attack. So it's all linked. Borers get in, borers into trees. Most borer species are actually an indication that the poor tree is already weakened and growing in poor conditions for a variety of reasons. Aphids love drought-stressed plants. Aphid populations thrive on plants that are drought stressed enough to make it easy for the aphid's mouth parts, little stylets, to puncture the cells. This is a cabbage plant picture I just took the other day. So, knowing that heat and drought, stress, or any of these other factors like nutrient deficiencies and things are cause a lot of damage, it's common sense to try and address those as a grower. I'm only leaving a little bit of a shopping list here. I'm not going to go into great detail on preventing these things because it's crop management. It depends what crop you've got. But a big one is being alert to weather and forecasts and prompt action, whatever it is. You might be mitigating heat by shading plants. You might be putting on shade fabric or lath houses or screens. One thing I've been experimenting with is running tall crops like early peas down the sides of all my garden beds on the southwest side, and then leaving the peas after they're finished because they're just they're actually dead. They're standing there on their trellises, but they're providing a shade for things on the other side of on the side away from the hottest sun. So I think we're going to have to think about more things like that. We're going to need to look for plant varieties and cultivars from warmer climates. We're trying new crops, alter planting schedules. And I think a lot of us are going to be moving fruiting crops like tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers out of greenhouses. It's just too hot. A lot of greenhouses have not been designed to be kept cool enough for the flowers of these crops now. Especially glass greenhouses. You can buy a beautiful turnkey glass greenhouse and set it up, and it is not dumping heat fast enough. You need high-speed fans. Those big greenhouses in the Lower Mainland have cooling systems. They actually do have cooling. They're not just blowing out the air. So we may have to rethink where we might grow some of these things. Rethinking how we prune tomatoes. We may need to go to production systems that basically leave a lot of leaves on the plants. And we're always going to need to be on top of irrigation timing and amount. Thick mulches, they don't just retain soil moisture, but they cool the soil as well. So these are just a few things that are going to be rising to sort of top of mind in our crop management. Now, there are some complex metabolic disorders that are made worse by weather extremes, but they can be a lot of things involved. It's the way the plant is, and this can be a variety specific problem, some varieties. Of course, the weather, how it's being irrigated, the soil nutrients, and cultural methods like, for example, how tree fruit is pruned. These all influence nutrient levels in the leaves, the flowers, or the fruit. Now, most of these disorders are actually made worse by hot weather and or drought. And a lot of them have to do with plants not able to get calcium from the soil. So when a plant is too hot or too dry or both, and it shuts down, that calcium that is in the soil is not getting to the plant. And that is the cause of a lot of these disorders. One of the things that does happen is when weather improves, is that you see the symptoms, whatever they were, don't occur when there's new leaves and new fruit that are developing after the conditions improve. So that's kind of diagnostic. If it was a disease, it would keep on getting worse. So remedying these kinds of disorders can require improving all of these, looking at all of this, how irrigation, nutrients, mulching, pruning practices. And these are very often taken to be disease. And look at these two, this lettuce and cabbage here. This is tip burn. Calcium coming from the soil. And calcium is a plant nutrient that actually isn't very mobile within a plant. If you feed a plant a nitrogen source, you put some fish fertilizer on a plant that's kind of pale yellow, within a week to 10 days, it'll be dark green because it mobilizes nitrogen quickly through the tissues. Calcium is a slow mover. And any kind of deficiency in the soil, of course, makes a deficiency in the plant. But usually it's when the soil is dry and the plant is no longer able to take up that calcium. Then you get a deficiency in the plant, even if it's, there was plenty of calcium in the soil. Another way you can get a calcium deficiency in fruit, particularly, is fruit growing way too fast. Variety. I love Honeycrisp. I've got a Honeycrisp tree, but boy, you really have to watch those trees because they love to make giant apples. And giant apples are growing way too fast and they can't move the calcium within the cells to the cells fast enough. And so don't prune thin the fruit too much. Don't feed high nitrogen fertilizers. You don't want to do that to a fruit tree anyway. But there's management that can cause fruit tissue to grow too fast and cause some of these disorders. Blossom end rot in tomatoes is a calcium deficiency in the fruit cells, and it can be in peppers as well. It's usually caused by irregular irrigation. It's too dry, and then maybe it's too wet. And container plants are very commonly show this because it's very hard to keep a container plant, the soil, evenly moist during a hot summer's day. They might require watering several times a day, and people are they don't realize they need to do it, or they're just simply not home to do it. It can be lack of calcium, and it can in the soil proper, and it can be made much worse by people who are trying to remedy the problem by putting Epsom salts on the soil, which is, don't even get me started on the Epsom salt thing because just don't. But anyway, so don't use Epsom salts. It only makes the problem worse. This is an irrigation problem in most cases. I like this picture. I was some friends' tomatoes. It was a pot plant on their deck. They went away on a trip. Before they left, they were watering their plant, and these fruits are beautiful. And after they came back, they were watering their plant, and these small fruits are beautiful. But while they were away, I don't think the person watering watered as often. And so only the fruit that was in that delicate stage right then as it was forming, while they were away, had blossom end rot. So you can see there's nothing wrong with their soil. It's a watering problem. A very similar group of disorders can happen in apples. It is functionally a calcium deficiency in the fruit cells. And it can be because your apple's growing really, really fast and the calcium can't catch up. But it's also drought conditions and in soil that just doesn't allow the trees to take up enough calcium fast enough from the soil. And some varieties are more prone. I mean, Gravensteins and Kings and Honeycrisps they're quite prone to this. And this is called watercord, and it's actually has very similar causes, but it's a strange sugar. These are all edible, at least. It's a strange sort of buildup of sugar in the apple. It won't keep, but it's edible. Bitter pit, once you get a lot of this, it's bitter. So it does, in fact, ruin the apple. So now you saw these disorders, what are you to think? They certainly look like disease. And on the one hand, here's apple scab, and on the other hand, this is bitter pit. Before you've cut open the apple to look for the bitter pit, you have to cut it open to see this. This really looks like could be a disease. So how to tell these apart? Is it a disease or is it a disorder or injury? What would be an abiotic? Something wrong with the environment. Well, if it's a pathogen, it's limited. Just one variety or one group of related plants. It might be just on apple trees, it might just be on bean plants, but it won't be on everything else. If it's a disorder, unrelated plants will have the same problem. If it's heat injury, you'll see it on a number of different plants growing in the area that are subjected to the same conditions. If it's a pathogen, if it's a fungal pathogen, then spores may be present. Spores wouldn't be present in a disorder or injury at first. Spores would only be present if the tissue had been dead long enough that botrytis or something moved in and started infecting it. But generally, spores in one case, like this powdery mildew, now we know we were looking at a pathogen. And a lot of pathogens start by attacking the oldest leaves first. And that's because the oldest leaves are losing some of their disease resistant. The youngest leaves have the most ability to prevent being infected. So when you see a pattern like this, the old leaves first, we know we're looking at a pathogen. If we're looking at a disorder or injury, the damage can occur, especially if it's something like heat, on any age of leaf or on one side of the plant that might be most exposed to the heat, or salt spray, or whatever the injury, whatever's doing the injury. So it can be random and just directional. And as soon as conditions improve, here's a injured grape leaves, here's all the new growth looks great. And a pathogen, that would not be the case. The new growth would start to becoming infected. Now, in the case of both of these, the recent weather is an important clue for both. And I can't emphasize enough, and I'll say it again later, is, keep weather records. They don't have to be fancy, just minimum, maximum temperatures for the 24 hours, min-max thermometer once a day, write it down. Precipitation. It's amazing how quickly we forget what happened last month, last spring, or last year. And the weather is really important in knowing what pathogens are likely to strike or what kind of injury we might have seen. So here's what I mean by directionality and injury. This apple tree actually was salt spray after a storm. You can see that it's kind of all ages of leaves, and it's all coming from one direction. The new leaves, the old leaves on this side are fine. The new leaves and the old leaves here are all injured. This is some arbutus leaves here after a really cold snap in February, and everybody was going, oh no, they all have disease. They didn't have disease. We just had cold enough weather that the bottom parts of the trees were frozen, frosted. Arbutus is on the edge of its range this far north, and when we get those really cold snaps, we can get frost injury, and it all happens overnight. It's pathogens never attack everything overnight. If it happens that fast, or it's very directional, and you pair that up with your weather records, then you have a better idea that the clues are in place that you can figure this out. Now, diagnosing diseases, of course, back to the weather records, yes, that's going to help, because in moist, wet weather, there are a certain set of diseases that are quite common. Downy mildew on onions, rusts of garlic and raspberries and beans. Now, remember, these pathogens are all different. Rust may look quite similar and have orange spores on all these different crops, but it's all different fungi. So if you had bad rust on your garlic, don't worry about it going onto your raspberries or beans. Apple scab, last year, apple scab was devastating because we had, very wet, cool weather right through till the end of the third week of June. And that was enough time for several generations of those fungi to spread all through apples. We had a lot of apple loss last year to pathogens. I haven't hardly seen a scab on anything this year because it was a very warm, dry May. So now some diseases appear in humid but dry weather. This is the time of year the powdery mildews come out. And again, that powdery mildew on the squash, or in this picture on a mustard leaf or a pea vine, these are all different species of powdery mildew. They look similar, but they're not the same. So again, the powdery mildew on those peas wouldn't spread to your squash. And then we have root rots, and root rots are an absolutely impossible thing. They're very hard to identify. Plant pathologists have lots of ways of very sophisticated laboratory testing to figure these out, but we're just looking at damage. But some of the clues are in the temperature and moisture conditions that actually, and the host plant, of course, can help you diagnose which one of these pathogens we're dealing with. So clues to diagnosing diseases, a lot of it's about the weather and temperature and moisture and the host plant. So fungus diseases in general, you can see spores usually, and often if it's something like a big piece of fruit or a leaf, there'll be a circular pattern. Fungi tend to grow that way, and this is the point of infection would have been in here, and the fungal colony is spreading, and this is the sporulation zone, and it's the color of the spores is also diagnostic. So rusts are some shade of orange usually, not all, but they mostly are. This is botrytis, also called gray mold, for a good reason. This is sort of like early infection, middle infection, and this is a late infection with the spores and the spore structures all over the strawberry. But when it's larger pieces of fruit or leaves, this concentric pattern is kind of typical. So again, the oldest leaves are often infected first because plants have the least defensive chemicals in their oldest leaves. And incidentally, for powdery mildew, if you can keep plants growing vigorously, the end of the season, maybe a little bit of liquid fish fertilizer or something like that and a little extra water, the new growth will keep ahead of the worst of the infection. Infections, again, injury and pathogens or diseases are linked as well, because often that's how pathogens get in, is the plant has been injured for a variety of reasons. So here we have an injury here. This is the lettuce I showed you. This is the calcium deficiency that caused the tip burn, which means the tissue has died, and now botrytis is moving into that dying tissue. This is a frost injury to an overwintered brassica, probably a broccoli, and now there is a secondary rot, and it's rotting right down through the stem. The rot didn't start this problem. The rot came in after a cold injury. And it's very common for fruit trees to get various pathogens. This in apples and pears, European canker, wherever bark is rubbing on a support post or is injured some way, that's how those pathogens get into the trees. So it's, if the bark had been intact, it wouldn't have happened. Now, insect damage can also be mistaken for disease. And in fact, insects, piercing and sucking insects, making holes can do the same thing in terms of allowing an opening for pathogens to get in. But sometimes it's just that they have similar symptoms. Thrips are incredibly tiny. This is under a microscope, this little teeny insect, but its feeding is leaving these funny little scabs and scars on the grapes. This is a powdery mildew of grapes, and this has scabs and scars too. So one is, one's a pathogen, one's an insect. Blister mites, mites are very tiny, and blister mites are even tinier mites. They're so small that you really can't see them without good microscope. And in this case, this is a common thing on pears, and it's actually mites. They're so tiny, making these little colonies and causing the leaves to make these lesions. But here's pear scab, and that's a fungus disease. And disorders, we're back to, here we have a bitter pit again. We're back to the fact that they can be mistaken for insect attack. This is apple maggot. Before you cut open the apple and find the little critter, this looks an awful lot like bitter pit. And sometimes it's really hard to tell these kinds of damage apart. Oops, I see a typo. Sorry about that. Tell these kinds of damage apart, like whether it's a disorder or in this case, tiny insects. The edema, which is a water imbalance disorder, it happens when the weather is really wet and the air is really humid, and it's actually an imbalance within the plant. And the cells rupture. Basically, they're taking up too much water and they can't really handle it. And then when they rupture, they dry up and die. And it's kind of the same as what happens when thrips attack a cell. Thrips are so tiny that they just clean out the cell. And again, the plant has a little scar there when that happens. So they look remarkably similar. So is it insect mite damage or is it a disorder? Well, we go back to this characteristics of disorder. Unrelated species, if plants in the same conditions, if they're all affected, it can't be an insect or a mite because they're really specific to a particular kind of plant. Often, except for the blister mites, which really you can't see with a hand lens, you need a microscope. Other mites and small insects or insect poop. Bug poop is a common thing that we can see left on leaves. The creatures have left, or they shake off when we try and inspect the leaves, but the poop stays behind. And the entomologists call that frass. And then they say things like, boy, the frass really hit the fan tonight. So organisms you might see or frass could be visible, but there wouldn't be any sign of that if there was a disorder. As a population of pests would grow, the damage would expand. But of course, if it's an injury from hot weather or a cold snap or something like that, the damage can occur much more suddenly, and it's probably on all ages of leaves or directionally. And as soon as the conditions improve, the new growth might be fine. If it's insects or mites, actually your inspections should show there's almost always beneficial insects and other predators showing up. So there's a whole other active biological community that will happen. The time of year is quite important in diagnosing insect and mite damage, which pest might be, because they have life cycles. A lot of them have only one generation a year. And if it's like, think of tent caterpillars. We have the tent caterpillars, the eggs are laid in the summer. They don't hatch till spring. They feed early in the spring, and then the caterpillars leave the trees. And once they've left the trees, with the first or second week of June, that's it. There are no more tent caterpillars. That's it for the year. So the weather isn't so important. In hot weather, they might grow a little faster, but basically it's not the weather, it's the time of year. Whereas if it's a disorder or injury, the recent weather, again, is still a really important part of your sort of detective job figuring this out. So where to start when there's a problem? Well, you keep an eye on problems. Ideally, you start keeping an eye on everything before there's a problem. And that means looking closely, doing it regularly. Now, in a number of agriculture crops, there's far more sophisticated scouting programs. And, you growers know who you are, I hope, and which crops that you get some help with extension IPM assistance in doing that. But in general, especially if you're a small mixed farm or a home gardener, what you're going to do is just look closely and do it regularly. So get a magnifying glass. Lots of times you can use a phone camera to magnify enough to see pretty well. But a good hand lens, a really good, just go to the drugstore and get the highest powered hand lens. This doesn't have to be from a science supplier. And it's really good to just have it, because it's unbelievable what you'll see under magnification. And keep records. That's the other thing. You have to keep records. It's easy to take photo records, just keeping a photo journal, but written records somewhere in whatever form works for you. The reason that you keep these records is that you can come back over time and tell whether a problem is getting worse or not. And I'll talk more about this next time. Sometimes by the time we notice the damage, actually, whoever did the damage has left. So if you keep coming back and looking, you'll notice that there isn't any more damage. Whatever you had is what you get. And then it also helps you know when and where to look. And again, some problems occur at the same time every year and on the same plants. And with your records, you can hone that into your location. Like I know exactly which week I need to look for imported currant worm on my currant bushes. I've got it down to about the same 2 weeks in April every year. And that means I don't have to look any other time of year. And then, as I said, I'm a really big proponent of people keeping their own weather records for their particular location. So the steps in diagnosing is looking closely. And so forget all the insects flying around out in the air, because none of them did any of that except for that little miserable white butterfly. So skip that, don't worry about them. So now what we need to do is inspect whatever's going on, looking for damage, and we want to look for organisms or signs that they've been there: bug poop, tiny insects, mites, spores, fungal growth, anything like that. Look, and then we want to look at the pattern of the damage. Look at the whole plant. Is it random or is it uniform? Does it seem to be coming from one direction? Is it only on one part of the plant that's in the sun or exposed to something else? Is it affecting the same age of leaves or all ages of leaves? You know, how does the new growth look? This is all the kinds of things that are going to tell you whether you might not actually be looking at a living organism that caused the problem, but at something environmentally caused. The timing of the damage. Did it all happen suddenly? That's usually a clue that it's an environmental problem. Did it happen gradually? Pathogens and pests build up gradually. Did it relate to any recent weather, wet weather or unusual weather, or high temperatures, low temperatures? And is it continuing to expand or spread? And this, by going back and checking regularly, that's what you learn. Is it actually continuing? You can tie ribbons onto the same leaves and keep looking at the same ones every time you go back and look, and that makes it easier to really tell. Now, when you start looking at potential problems, everything needs to fit. And the first one is host plant, so that you're not actually wondering if apple trees have leaf curl disease, because they don't. In my book, and a lot of pest diagnostic books have done this, and that's why I've done it in my book, they'll actually have the plant species listed with the pathogens and pests that are common or typical of those plants. So you can very quickly rule out 99% of what's in the book as it didn't attack your apple tree or your cabbage. These are the specific things. You can start working your way through those. Does the appearance of the damage or the appearance of the organism itself, is it consistent with everything about the description that you're looking up? Is the time of year right? Are the weather conditions right? Is it in this region? People are very often Googling something, and there's nothing wrong with using Google to try and figure some things out. But the filters you need to run that information through include, is it here? You know, once you have some idea of what you might be looking up, then you can Google blah, 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 the pest, and put British Columbia behind it. And that really shortens up your list. You'll find things very quickly that are here, because a lot of things occur all around the world that we don't have to worry about. And there's a lot of similar things here that are similar elsewhere, but it's not the same. So most of the time we're going to be working from damage, because if you rule out all the insects flying around as being okay, they're not the problem, then we often don't find the critter. So we get large holes in leaves. What makes large holes in leaves? Well, slugs, of course, and caterpillars. Birds do. This is all bird damage here. Birds have just picked away at these beans. Sometimes it's caterpillars and slugs and birds all together. Sometimes you need to go out at night and look for the culprits, because that's when a lot of caterpillars feed. Certainly when slugs are out. It's a number of pest problems that are really our worst ones, like climbing cutworms. They're nocturnal, and you need to go out after dark to see them. What about brown spots on leaves? Whoa, is it fungi? Is it a bacterial disease? Is it sun scald, which is heat injury? Was it hail? Is the plant wilting? Well, there's root diseases, but there's root insects. Is it just the temperatures are too high? Is the soil too dry? Do you live where voles are actually chewing on the roots? It's not easy to identify from damage. Plant distortions is a common symptom, a distorted tissue, and there's many causes. In this case, these freesia flowers were distorted by cold. And here's the same looking distortion, but it's actually aphids. Distorted peas, peonation mosaic virus, very common here, spread by aphids usually in July and August. So you grow peonation mosaic resistant peas and you don't see that happen. But it is a virus disease spread by insects. Here we have curling up leaves on apples, and this is, I'm waiting to see the photo that might be sent to me to determine if this is what this person meant, because this is an insect and it's not a virus and it's not the cold and it's not aphids. Plants respond to sucking insect saliva in really weird ways, causing them to look diseased again or just really strange. This is this is a currant leaf, a red currant or a black currant. If you turn the leaf over and look under the underside of these red puckers, you'll see just one or two little tiny aphids in there, and the plant has managed to react to the saliva of the aphids this way. This is a cabbage aphid, or very early on a cabbage infestation on, I think it's Brussels sprouts. Weird distorted foliage. So you again can be very misled by symptoms on plants. And a really important thing, and this is kind of my last part of this module tonight, is don't assume you found the culprit or the pest if you see an insect on a damaged leaf. In this case, this is a scale insect, a cottony scale insect, and this is the larva of a native lady beetle that is eating it. So this is not the pest. This is the predator, but it's pretty blobby and weird, and it doesn't look like a lady beetle. Over here, though, we have this different situation. We have aphids here, and this larva of a different native lady beetle, a little black one called Skimnus, it's actually, this is the larva of the lady beetle. It looks kind of like cottony scale, but it's eating these aphids. So it's not easy. I mean, honestly, if you see creatures on the leaf, I mean, is this a good bug gone bad? It's a lady beetle. No, it's eating these tiny little sawfly larvae, which unless you're under magnification, you're not going to even see those. And this is quite common. This white worm here, it's 1 or 1.5 centimeters long. It's in the soil, it's in our garden soil, it's in our crop soil. I know that there are at least a few of you saying, I know that's a wireworm, but it's not. It's a predator of a wireworm. That's a wireworm with a hole punched in it by this fly larva. And so they're found where the wireworms are. They're the same shape and size as wireworms. They're much paler, but I have, plenty of people have said to me, oh yeah, there's yellow wireworms and there's white wireworms. No, there's not. There's predators. So learning what beneficial insects look like is a really important part of trying to identify anything going on, especially things like eggs. I mean, the eggs aren't going to run away on you. They'll be stuck to the leaves. These are lady beetle eggs. That's a hoverfly or syrphid fly egg and a massive predator of aphids. These weird things stuck to plants are just the pupa cases of lady beetles. So here's the good news. For most all of our crops, there are only a few common pests and pathogens that affect them. So we're not looking at the universe of everything in my book being wrong with apple trees or cabbage plants. It's just a few. So once you get them correctly identified, then you know for this, for your future crop years, then you can find out how to deal with it using organic methods and prevention in future. And, I said this right at the beginning, if you can't identify a problem, then operating on the assumption that whatever is going wrong is due to something with the growing conditions, most of the time, more times you're going to be right than wrong if you make that assumption. So reviewing recent weather, soil fertility, whatever's going on with irrigation, are plants watered enough? Are they cool enough? Are they mulched enough? Is it a plant that's well adapted to the current climate? That's all things that you can control without ever figuring out, without it being a pest problem. And I'll just leave you this little thought. Not everything has an explanation. There's some really weird things that are perfectly normal. Anybody going Josta berries has seen this. It's really weird, and there's absolutely no explanation, and it's totally normal. And serrano peppers, this cracking, that's an indication of a good pepper. So some of this is not a problem. And we're going to address specific problems next time on October 10th, and it's called Cut Your Losses, Managing Pests and Diseases in Food Crops. I probably wouldn't talk much more about preventing or managing the environmental problems because I did that tonight. But if something is really a burning question, we can certainly take that next week. And so there we go. I have put all the pictures in all my books, plus a whole lot more, on my website. So it's just a database of including beneficial insects and pests and diseases and things. So that just to help you identify what the problem is, because that's the hard part. And that's really why we did this workshop tonight. So over to you.
Yes, thank you, Linda. That was fabulous. I don't know whether I laughed harder at the thought of mistaking those wire worms
Yeah.
to the predator, or the fluffy little white butterfly that is really actually the real pest that we know, isn't it? That just really identifies quickly. So we're going to move in now into a question and answer period that Kaya has curated and is relaying to Linda. And just as a let you know that the questions that you have for the October 10th session that Linda's just spoken about, you can send those questions to growlocalssi@gmail.com. Kaya will put that, yeah, she's already done it. She's put it in the chat right now, that email. So those will be the questions that you're going to send to that session for October 10th, where we're going to be dealing with these, managing these pests and diseases problems. So that's sort of the Q&A go-to process. And I think what we'll do now is leave this over to you. Are you seeing questions there, Linda, that you want to address? And
I think Kaya's going to feed me the questions here.
Yeah, I've got a list here. I've got questions which we'll probably answer tonight, which are related to diagnosing and assessing.
Sure.
And then lots of the questions were also around how to solve, which I think we're going to
Oh, good. So we're
cover.
going to keep track of those. If you put something in the chat, we've got it. And it'll go into, now I don't promise to address everything that everybody's asked about, because that would be like a 3-day workshop, but I will go for things that are either asked about the most and or things that have been very common or most devastating. So I will make a bit of a judgment call myself there as well, but that's what we'll do next week, next session. So thanks, Kaya.
Okay.
What are people asking about?
When do you recommend doing soil tests for gardeners in the Lower Mainland? Fall, spring?
Well, you know, in the fall, the labs are not so busy. In the spring, they're busy. So, you know, just do it. You know, do it now, and then you'll know what you need to do for liming or not, or nutrients. So I think that's the best idea. Don't wait. Yeah, don't delay, because you don't want to be hung up next spring trying to figure out what to do.
Evie asks, what is the cause of root rot on beans and what to do about it? I don't think we'll answer the what to do about it necessarily, but what about the cause of root rot?
Well, root rot, there are actually in our soils, naturally in the soil, there are quite a lot of microorganisms that can attack plants and cause root rots under certain conditions, but they don't do it all the time. They need to have the right conditions of temperature and moisture, waterlogging or root injury, or roots might have been attacked by insects and allow the pathogens in. So usually a root rot is usually caused by a pathogen that killed the roots, but why the pathogen was there and why it infected the root is a question. We have to review our management methods. Some of them live in the soil and build up. If you keep growing garlic in the same spot, it always ends in tears, because a number of the pathogens that cause root rots in garlic build up in the soil. And so by planting every year with the same host plant, you cause that pathogen to have lots and lots more spores. So the best remedy is usually crop rotation for all of these. for things like beans that really, really don't tolerate wet soil. So checking that you're not overwatering, or that that they're not in a low spot or a soggy ground. I mean, they really, really need good drainage. So a lot of these root rots, all you can do is provide good conditions. There's nothing you can pour into the soil that will control it.
Linda. Kathleen asks, is there a known stem boring pest that targets Monarda, bee balm? 2 years in a row, I've had the same problem, but haven't been able to identify the culprit.
I don't know, you got to catch the critter. And that may, and I don't know. Any monarda I've grown has never been attacked, so I haven't had a chance to catch the critter. So, some of this is detective work. Some of it is, and I'll tell you one thing about insects, pest insects, for example, is that the populations rise and fall. There's a lot of things that alter their populations. So you could have a pest problem one year and not even see it next year or the year after, and it's nothing that you did. I know people have complained to me about, oh, it's a horrible yellow jacket year. Well, I didn't see any in my house, but that's localized, very common for these populations to be affected by other things. So, I don't know. I haven't seen it, so you have to catch some little critter.
Last one in the diagnostic category, Liz asks how to tell whether plants have been overwatered or not watered enough, especially seedlings.
Soil. You put your finger in the soil. If you're really having a hard time with that, is seedlings, you can lift the tray by the weight. Like, water that tray well till the soil, the soil is moist, and feel what it feels like lifting it up. So experienced people will go in, they're growing lots of seedlings, and they'll just flip. They can easily tell by looking at the surface, but also by the weight of the tray, that it's clearly too dry. It shouldn't be too hard to do, to even take just a very fine knife or implement and dig down in the soil if you really, really can't figure it out. But usually, especially seedlings, it's the weight of it.
Thank you. Do you want to hear some of the how to solve questions, or are we trying to save up the good stuff for next time?
Well, yeah, I don't want to get, too lost on how to deal with particular problems. So if anybody has questions about how they're going to proceed in identifying problems, or I would actually like to hear about some experiences of disorders this summer, or things that they've discovered. If you just have a nice long list of pests to deal with, we'll winnow that after the class, after the talk. So whatever you'd like to do.
Or do we want to invite people to write their experiences in the chat, or unmute and speak them?
Whatever works. It's a lot of screens. Can you see? I guess if you put your little yellow hand, your little signal hand up, you'll pop up to the top screen. Because I think there's 4 screens of people here.
Sounds good. We got another question. In the meantime, if anyone's thinking about an experience to share, you can just raise your hand in the chat. What about using sticky traps to catch insects?
Well, sticky traps catch insects, but most insects are not pests. So right there, we got a problem. So the best sticky traps are particular colors in particular places for very specific pests. So just catching bugs on traps is basically destructive. So, if you have fungus gnats in your home, in your house plants or your home greenhouse, bright yellow sticky traps inside the greenhouse will catch fungus gnats and whiteflies. They're very attracted to yellow, and it's a great way to catch them. You take that yellow trap out in the garden and you start catching aphid predators. So it's got to be a particular kind of sticky trap for a particular kind of thing. Winter moth here is a caterpillar. The moths actually are out in the winter, believe it or not. That's why they're called that. The females can't fly. They just have these little stubs of wings. So when they come out of their cocoons below a fruit tree or a boulevard tree, the females have to walk up the tree out to the ends of the branches to lay their eggs. Now, because this is a wintertime insect, the females aren't doing that till November or December. So you can put a sticky band around a tree trunk just at that time of year and intercept the female as she's walking up the tree, and so she never lays her eggs. It's a fantastic system, but it totally does not work for any other species or at other times of the year. So just the trees that are attacked by winter moth at the time of year when winter moth is out, then we don't do much damage. But if you put a sticky band on a tree in the summer, there's lots of beneficials, and also kids and their bicycles and dog tails and everything else that get caught in sticky bands on trees, you know. So it's, as a technology, in some places it works great, in other places it's very inappropriate.
All right. One more question about the traps. Is there a trap specifically for flea beetles?
Well, there's trap plants for flea beetles. That's and actually I think flea beetles is something we're definitely going to cover in depth next time, because they're a bit tricky. But the flea beetles that go on cabbage family, there's two kinds of flea. Okay, it gets really complicated. There's the tuber flea beetles, which are on potatoes, tomatoes, and things, and that related nightshades. And then there's the cabbage flea beetles, which get onto some cabbage family plants, but they don't get onto them all. They don't, there's a lot of host plants that they, in that family, that those flea beetles don't particularly care for. And there's some that they just love, like green mustard leaves. And you can use the green mustard as a plant to attract them off of your broccoli, for example. So that's a trap plant. So with some care, you can kind of do a push-pull with pests, but again, in a very particular situation.
Brilliant. All right, so we've got two stories to share. Veronica says, my mom had a crazy amount of whitefly this year. That's it.
Well, you know, and when people tell me that, we have to back right up to, are you sure it's whitefly? Because, you know, it might not be. Everybody had leafhoppers at the end of the year, and they fly up your nose too, just like whiteflies. And it's possible, of course, she has whiteflies, but I always need to see a picture. I need to know more, because they're always mistaken for each other. In fact, almost always when people tell me they have whitefly, it turns out to be leafhopper, which doesn't rule whiteflies out. It just means that it's not as likely as you might think.
Liz.
So once we know whether it's whiteflies, then we have a whole different approach. If it's leafhoppers, we don't need to do anything. So.
All right, Liz says that she would like to raise her hand, but can't figure out how to do it. So Liz, if you want to unmute and just share into the group, that'd be great.
Might be page 4 deep. Just shout out, Liz, if you got a question. Did she put the question in the chat?
No, she wanted, I think, to share an experience.
Oh, okay.
Just asked her to unmute. But in the meantime, maybe Brian has asked, is it possible to control gray aphids on kale?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that's really important to know about aphids is they attack and really reproduce on plants that are drought stressed. And of course, whose plants weren't drought stressed this year? So good watering practices. It's also easy to wash them off. And then your other point of attack, I guess, and I'll talk about this more next time, is that you make that area, the crop area, attractive to the predators of aphids, because they just clean this up if they have their own food supply. So you bring in the predators, you can wash the aphids off with water, and you can make sure the plant is not stressed by lack of water. And if you're short on water, then heavy mulching goes a long way to preserve that soil moisture. So you do what you can. And I'll tell you, if your kale is just clobbered by aphids right now, don't panic, because the aphids are all going into their wintering cycle. It's called diapause, but never mind, sort of like hibernation, or they lay eggs or something. Anyway, they're going to all be disappearing. So the kale that you'll get in the winter and the kale from the same plants next spring will not have aphids. So maybe they're too gooey and weird right now, but don't worry about it. Just wash them off and leave them. And you'll still get a crop.
Awesome. Liz, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to tell us about your strawberry leaf issue briefly? All right. Oh, you have 5 seconds, then we're moving on.
Liz?
All right, moving on.
Okay.
Lauren says, I covered my cabbages thinking that I could keep the cabbage moth out. They managed to get in and the worms caused havoc. I took the netting.
Oh boy, everybody does. That's exactly
Yeah.
everybody. This comes back to understanding the darn little critters. For one thing, I'll just put a plea in here. I know it's futile, but as an entomologist, I can't stand them being called cabbage moths. It's like somebody that keeps calling my dog a cat. It drives me mad. Because they're butterflies, and that's not a moth. But anyway, I'm sure you don't really care. It is a caterpillar. You're absolutely right. The problem is that before you covered the plants, there probably were already a couple eggs laid on them, because they're really hard to see. Those little tiny seedlings will come from the nursery with 1 or 2 eggs on them. So you plant them in your garden, and then you put your insect netting over it. You do a really good job with the insect netting, and all you did was trap them inside. And they just keep reproducing in there because they have all the food they want, and the predators that would eat them, all the yellow jackets and paper wasps and all those flies and parasitic wasps and birds now are blocked out. So usually when people try and cover their plants to keep off the cabbage butterfly, they end up absolutely getting slaughtered. Now, if you did cover your crops before they came up from seed, you can usually manage to keep them out, because they're not on the cover is on before the plant comes up from seed, from the soil. Then you can keep them off. But if the leaves touch the netting, the butterflies are capable of shoving an egg through the netting onto a leaf that's touching. So depending what your netting is, it can be that they can force an egg onto the leaf if it's touching the netting. But so it's usually impossible to keep them off with netting. And if you throw it all open to all those predators, they will take care of it. You'll see the butterflies laying eggs in your cabbage, and you'll go out there and you'll see a little hole and some frass, and nobody's there because somebody has come along and eaten it. I never, ever see little green caterpillars in my broccoli or chewing up things. They're all just intercepted before they ever arrive at a size that causes any damage. So you might experiment with that. So if you want to continue covering, then you need to cover before the plants come up from seed. If you want it, but I suggest everybody really try and make your garden hospitable to beneficial insects, and then it's way less work. They do the job.
Thanks so much, Linda. That's all the time we have for questions today.
Okay,
I've recorded
so
everything
a
else.
nice list of things here. A nice list of problems to talk about.
Yes. And I'm going to hand it over to Sheila to do a close and a thank Linda.
Yes, and thank you very much for your assistance, Kaya, and for all of the questions that have ranged from powdery mildew to insect damage and everything in between. And we're looking forward to continuing this conversation